Hi, everyone. I'm really sorry to ask you to stop talking for a second. Thanks for coming along. It's so nice to see you all. We have both are really happy to see so many friends in the audience, which is really lovely. So thanks for coming. So we're both really excited that we're going to be sharing our research and work with you, and we're really excited to have a Q&A with it. So I'm going to present first, then Eliza, then we're going to have a Q&A, and then don't tell Mike, but there are drinks in the bar afterwards. So if you stay to the end, you get drinks. And then we're going to secretly, Eliza's planning to share some samples with you, and I might do a small workshop with you upstairs, depending on how interested people feel. So yeah, so I think that's everything.
Yeah.
You?
Yeah. So now we're going to introduce each other. So this is Malik. His pronouns are he, him. He's Irish. No, he describes himself as a melange. I don't know why this bit keeps disappearing from my notes.
I don't know why.
He's Irish and Pakistani and grew up in London. He says, there we go. He says he looks like a melange with stubble, curly hair and bushy eyebrows. He's a chartered structural engineer, a qualified school teacher and a regenerative practitioner. And he's currently researching regenerative design, low carbon design and natural materials.
Thanks. Okay, I can't do this sitting down, so I have to stand up. Cool, so, and this will work. We've had a week of talks we've had a couple of days of talks so far about the kind of situation that we're currently in. We've seen snippets from the IPCC reports showing kind of where we are, the trajectory for temperature and carbon and things. What's interesting, if you read one of the more recent IPCC reports, it actually talks about which sectors are kind of heavily involved in this and have got to make the biggest kind of changes. And then it's interesting, it relates it also to the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's really interesting is that buildings and our urban systems typically have the largest impact onto all of those. So as designers, we kind of have the responsibility to make some kind of change because we can change all of the aspects that are affecting humanity. And one of the things that I'm always really interested in, the thing that I'm always kind of driving towards is inhabitable architecture. I think there's space for art, I think there's space for temporary buildings, and I really, really strongly believe in permanent homes that people are comfortable in, that don't cost the earth to make, that are safe to build, and promote a better environment. And so in my journey of learning about that, I've kind of started to move into regenerative design. And I'm doing a PhD in regenerative design. I've been part of the Regenesis training course in the States, learning about regenerative design. I've been part of a lab in the UK. I've been running workshops at universities. And yeah, that's kind of my credentials to talk to you today. And where I'm coming from, I'm sure everyone's kind of heard the regenerative term banded around. And so I think there's people who are using it in a kind of interesting way, and I think there are those who are in some ways co-opting it. And so I come from this kind of Regenesis lineage here, with the first book written about regenerative design by John Tillman Lyle in 1996. And that's the kind of school that I've been doing most of my learning from. I think there are some people who've been looking at this more recently. You have the kind of Flourish book, who are looking at it from more of a culture perspective and don't have that same kind of legacy or history that they're drawing back on when they do this. And then there's a research group in Europe called Restore, and again, they do some interesting work. I think it comes from just a kind of different strand or a different way of looking at this. And typically, whenever you see regenerative design talked about, you're going to see this diagram. And it's kind of showing regenerative design on a scale going from conventional to green to sustainable to restorative to regenerative. And it seems, and I agree, it seems really easy and accessible to kind of get. And I think it's somewhat there. I think when the green movement came along, when people invented it, when they were trying to push for better buildings through the green movement, they weren't trying to create something that we now think of as greenwashing, which was just where you nominally put something on it. That's the kind of term that we have with that. And so then we had to create sustainable to really talk about better design. And in the same way, I think unfortunately is that there's kind of a regenerative washing that's going on, where people are just saying, oh, if we do more good than bad, then we're being regenerative. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it is good to be doing more good than bad. But I think actually what's exciting is that regenerative design is kind of pushing that paradigm. It's saying actually what happens when you go beyond this idea of doing more good than bad. And it actually changes the way that you have to design, the scope, the roles, what you have to think about when you do that. So this, on the other hand, you're kind of getting definitions for regenerative design that are coming out like this, which is just saying, provided it absorbs carbon, it's regenerative. And I think we'd all kind of agree that it's got to be something more to it than that. So, you're all here. Hopefully you kind of are curious, so we all want some definitions. So the first one I'm going to give you is urban regeneration. Urban regeneration, or regeneration, I would say is very separate to regenerative design. It has a history, it has connotations with it. Often we connect it to poor areas being built on, being gentrified. And regeneration is not really what we talk about when we think about regenerative design. Recently, there's been a rise of a term called regenerative materials. And often that seems to be materials that are grown, and provided that they're grown, that they can renew, it's called regenerative. And again, I think that's great, but I don't think it actually takes up the whole entire picture. Is everyone ready to see my definition of regenerative design? Is that all right? Okay, this is my very long and the best definition of regenerative design that I've seen. I'm not going to read it. I'll let you guys read it in your own time. But I think it's interesting because it incorporates terms, incorporates language, incorporates processes that I think are new, are novel, are different. And so if you want to be engaging in regenerative design and development, if those terms aren't coming up in your work, then you're possibly not doing it in as deep a way as you probably could be working on it. Any questions about this so far? All right. So everyone wants a really kitsch definition. So the definition that I kind of work with whenever I have to do that is I say that it's place-sourced, not place-based, it's place-sourced. It's designing systems that thrive, that co-evolve and renew. And hopefully you can see my kind of summary definition there comes from Bill Reed, from Pamela Mung, from Regenesis, who've been working again in this area for 30 years and have done projects and seen the kind of consequences of what they've done. So that's kind of useful. And hang on, I'll just let you people grab some photos of it. That's fine. And one of the ways that we kind of talk to people about this when we start working on projects is we use this framework. This is called the levels of work, and we kind of use this as a way of starting to talk to people about it. And the way that it works is there are different kind of levels of complexity that we might work in a project. So for example, and none of these are bad. Operate is an important one, maintain is an important one, but we have to, the exciting part is when we go higher, when we go beyond improving. And so, for example, if we were doing a co-housing project, there are some fundamental things that we need to operate. We need kind of houses. We need people just to have a kind of co-housing project. Right, we've got those houses, we've got those people. Then the next stage up would be to go to maintain. We need ways of maintaining those houses and maintaining the connections that are there, maintaining the people's experiences, the community that's there. So we have to go to the maintain level. We can go beyond that. We can start to think about improving things. We can start to think about integrating renewable systems, water catching systems. So we can go to that improve level. And then I think regenerate is going even further than that. It's going beyond the kind of normal scope of what we might think of as buildings and their impacts. But they always have them. And so this is when it starts to actually affect a wider system that it's working within. So does it enable other people to develop co-housing projects? What happens to the children of people from that co-housing project? Where do they go? Are you enabling them to have their own co-housing project in the future? Do you create systems that connect this site to its surrounding neighbors? Because when you make a building, it always interacts with its neighbors. So this is one way that we kind of work through those levels for projects. Anyone got any questions about that? All right. So you kind of want to get more into this. I think this book, Regenerative Development and Design, is a really good book. It's kind of got these 9 principles. It's a pretty good read. And I'm going to it'd be lovely to be able to talk to you about all of them. But I'm going to focus on one of them. I'm going to focus on the second one, talking about partnering with place. I think is with generally architects, built environment people, this is kind of the one that might be closest to our hearts. So that's hopefully that. And I'm going to talk about this aspect of knowing what to build on a site. And one of the kind of things that we've all experienced, hopefully, I need you to draw back in your heads to a situation where you know a place that has a really nice energy. It might be a series of small markets, or it might be somewhere that has a really nice nightlife. We've kind of all seen those places. Sometimes they're really informal, but they're really nice. And then eventually someone sees that, they see it as an opportunity, and they kind of fix it. They repair it, they make it into something way more flashy than it needed to be. And by doing that, by making that change, the kind of energy of that place disappears. Does everyone know, can think of somewhere where that's happened to them before? So there's a character to a place, and that's what we're trying to understand through a process that we call storing place. And so, sure, you can plant a rose garden in any kind of ground, and you can totally do that. That's fine, and you'll have roses. But actually, if you worked out what that ground would be best suited to, you could create something that thrives even more. And that's what we're about. So I'm going to talk to you about my ongoing research project. It's at Woolworth Gardens. It's this little red dot down here. And I'm going to tell you about London. I'm going to tell you about the story of place that I've researched so far. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to look for patterns. I want you to look for things that I say that are repeat, either that worked well or that didn't work well, that kind of seem to kind of mess with that place. And then we'll see if we can come up with some stories and some patterns by the end of this. Everyone okay with that? All right. So I'm going to try and go slowly, but I'm very bad at that. So this is Woolworth Gardens at the moment. It's a really nice community garden project. It's got it just grows an amazing range of plants. It has this lovely ecological kind of corner where foxes are able to hang out, and lots of plants and lots of animals are able to be there. It has different kind of growing spaces, and it has these kind of teaching spaces that it uses. And I originally got involved in this project because they were going to make an outdoor classroom, a teaching space during COVID. And so we built this kind of structure, but we also were working on it from a carbon perspective and trying to work out how many ways we could kind of reduce the carbon impact of the project. So anyway, this is London. I hope some of you have been there before. It's London, the south of the river is you can see that the Thames meanders. The geology is there's a clay layer, and because of this proximity to the river, it's got a very rich and organic soil. It's very marshy, it's really good for growing things on. So this kind of area south of the river a while ago was really good at growing things. And London developed on the north side of the river. So although the site is now in London, it was once outside of London and south of the river and unconnected to that kind of place. It was also, you can't see it at this scale, but it was kind of wet. It was a marshy land. And what's interesting is the other part is that the London south of the river was a kind of bohemian area. It kind of was a place away from the kind of officialness of London. So it had brothels, it had theatres, it had writers. So it had this radical side to the river. And then London was growing and connections were put in. And those connections went past the site. So even when the city walls kind of came out, the site was kind of still outside of London. And it was growing, lots of food for London. There were roads that went past, but it was growing food that would be taken into London. The area was referred to as the larder of London. And then slowly London was growing more. It still was kind of to the side of things. It's still a wet kind of space. It was common land, so people used it for grazing. And it was also near, so roads kept being made, rail was put in, and it seemed to always pass by the site. It never went through the site, and it remained common land, growing land, grazing land for quite a long time. And then it's also the place nearby where the Chartist movement would meet and would march to demand the vote. And then it continued to be developed, London continued to be developed, and actually we got one of the largest pleasure gardens in London was actually built right next to this. It's this kind of really big idea of drawing people to a garden, and I think it had one of the largest concert halls. And that didn't succeed, and so it was turned into housing. So the area is built on, and as most of London, it suffered during the Second World War and was bombed. And areas nearby were cleared, and parks were put in, so green spaces were added in. And I don't have any more maps from this point, but it also then became a place where the London squatting movement came, where women in print were. The site then, later on, was developed by a squat nearby. They worked with a radical female construction group called Matrix, and they designed this building using a slightly radical construction method, the Walter Siegel method of construction. And Woolworth Gardens originally started as part of the city farm movement, this kind of way of bringing green spaces back into the cities. It realized it was too small for animals, so it just focused on plants. And it now has kind of 7 ponds on it, which kind of a lot of the ecology in the area are really drawn to. Oh, and then they used to have bees. So that's my potted history of Woolworth Gardens. And so my question to you is, what patterns did you see? What kind of things seemed to work well on the site? Which things didn't seem to work well on the site? And this is for audience participation. So any answers, there's no wrong answers. Come on, I gave you a really long story. Yes?
So unsuccessfully the policy because animals didn't work on the site. But then more recently you said the introduction of wild animals, so like foxes, birds, that kind of uncontrolled wildlife, animal-wise came back in.
Yeah, I think that's a good one, uncontrolled wildlife. So I think it was there, it disappeared, and then it's returned. And I think that's a really good one. Anything else? Yeah?
I guess you said it used to be quite marshy, and now it's the city's kind of grown into a very concrete place, and it's trying to, I guess it's trying to retain that kind of, not marshiness, but kind of what it used to be, kind of.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's interesting for the site to have been green and then have been built on, and then for it to be unbuilt on and becoming greening space. So there's kind of this marshy kind of water aspect to the site that was there, that disappeared, and it was returned, and it seems to do really well. There's some other things I forgot to tell you about the garden. The garden does a lot of work in the area. It teaches people how to garden, spreads horticultural skills to people. It does workshops for people for welfare, so they can kind of understand, so they can kind of have a natural space to come to. It also does, it grows on itself the kind of plants that it then takes to the projects that it works on. And it's trying to be much more inclusive. It has projects which are for people of color, horticultural evenings, and also queer botany evenings. So those are some other things I forgot to say. Any other patterns that anyone saw? Yeah?
Like it was always left over somewhere?
Yeah, I think there's this aspect of it always being to the side, left over. And I think there was that moment when it tried to become like a big deal. And I don't think that worked very well on that site. And as it goes back to being a much quieter spot, I think that seemed to work. Yeah. Yeah?
Would you also say it's also down to the context, like it being close to the wall? So like the ground foundations on this kind of building, this might be uneven surface of the building. So they are smaller, like the house building.
No. You're right. There is an aspect to it. It is difficult working in a bomb damaged context and built in an urban environment where there's lots of rubble and things like that. So actually, they have incorporated in their site rubble gardens, which are kind of helping people learn how they can do that. They haven't actually excavated all of the old foundations on the site. They're kind of working with what's already there. So they're like, it's there. Let's try and leave it for as long as we can. And let's not dig it out unless we have to. So yeah, I guess there's like I guess that's a new one. That is a new one. I'm just going to put rubble. I don't know. It didn't seem to have any rubble, but then it seems to be okay with that rubble. So I think that's a good one. Thanks. I've not had that before. Please. Agriculture, a sense of growing. And again, that seemed to be something that was there, disappeared, and then seems to continue. One of the ones I like is their radical approach as well. I think there's a history of radicalism on that area, on that site. And again, that's what they seem to be leaning into as a group. And it's really interesting. You can kind of see these patterns. You can see how they operate. And it feels like whenever they do something that they're always pushing at an open door because there's just this they're always working with the patterns that are already there.
Are they aware of the other community gardens that are spread all over them?
Yes, they do. Actually, some of the graduates from their garden, from the changes that they're making, then go on to lead other community gardens and work with other horticultural networks. So that's been really successful. So that was one project that was looking at one part, the essence, and what a place wants to be. I think what you might be curious about is to see what this might look like in a larger context. So I've kind of chosen a project that I always find really interesting, that I find kind of works really well to kind of encapsulate all of these aspects. This one was done by Regenesis. This is the Battleboro Co-op. You can read about it on their website. And it's really interesting because they were originally asked to just make a supermarket. And Regenesis were like, no, this is part of a system. You're going to be getting food from somewhere. You're going to have people who are interacting with your buildings. There's definitely a kind of a wider network that you could start to think about. And so what they did is they decided to kind of partner with the people. They realized actually what they needed to do is they wanted to create a community-driven kind of local food produce network that was growing the things that they wanted. So actually the kind of building is a supermarket, but it's actually also a training school for the kind of farmers in the area to learn what they want so they can learn better growing skills. And also it has a farmer's market, so they can sell their products directly at this place. So it's taking an original brief, just a supermarket, and trying to see actually how can you do some of these other things? How can you look at the other stakeholders and kind of give them a way to engage? How can you see that there's a potential on this site? How can you find a distinctive value-adding role? It's really interesting once you start to look at this, that you kind of, by understanding a place, by kind of looking further ahead, you can kind of think and make larger impact projects like this. And I'm running out of time, but one of the other things that you might want to have a quick look at later on is understanding kind of the boundaries of your projects. I think we, as an industry, have this kind of hard line of the site boundary, and that's never really true. Even when we have a site boundary, we think about what we want to get out of the site, or we think about what we want to put on the site. This is what I want. And actually trying to think of your project as connected to other places that might evolve with your project, and how those might then have impacts outside of those networks. So, for example, with Woolworth Gardens, they exist, but then actually they work throughout the entire borough. So that's probably one of their networks that they're part of. And they're trying to actually influence the whole horticultural industry. So there's a kind of even larger network that they're trying to integrate with. And this is the way we normally show that, through kind of your project, identifying a series of nested systems that your project might be part of. I've only been here for half an hour. I'd love you to find out more. I think this paper is really nice. If you do want to look at it, this book is really good. If you want to know more about making a story of place, I'd look at the bioregion one. And then we do training courses about this kind of stuff. And if you don't believe me, you can read some more projects on the Regenesis website. So this is what I would suggest that you look at if you are curious. And that's everything that I'm going to talk to you about. And I'll let you take photos. But thank you. So everyone, Thank you. This is Eliza Collin, all Zs, no Ss. Eliza identifies as she, her. She is a white woman from Cornwall with light brown hair, which ends just below her shoulders. Eliza calls herself a design researcher. Her practice spans disciplines and species using design to build networks and interventions for futures with agency. She has an MA in the Material Futures from Central St. Martin's and most recently completed the Design Museum's Design Researcher Residence. Without further ado, here you are.
Thank you. I'm not sure when Mike invited us whether he realised there would be so many crossovers in our work, but actually it's ended up being really fruitful to spend time together and to talk about each other's research. And so in a way, the projects that I'm going to talk through now in some way speak to the kinds of systems that Keen's been working on, and then we can speak more about that afterwards.
Yeah.
So thank you, and thank you for having me. I'd like to start by asking the room, with a show of hands, how many people here regularly collaborate with people outside of their specific field? Great. And how many people feel like that's an important part of the design process or of the processes that they work on? Cool, okay, so maybe I'm preaching to the converted, but that's fine. I'll show you my way of doing things. And so I'm going to talk about multidisciplinary collaboration and future building in the face of the climate emergency. And there are kind of three areas of design, or the way that I use design within my work as a designer. Designing tools for noticing, which is something specifically picked up from what Anna Singh talks about. Designing for agency and change, so using design to try and create opportunities for agency with people that use those designs, and design for communication, translation, collaboration, and intervention. So I call myself a design researcher, and this is a term that can be used in many different ways, but for me, that means using practice-based design processes and methodologies to develop ideas around specific research questions. And so that's using techniques such as making, workshops, physical interventions backed up by design methodologies. So the way designers do things such as user testing, rapid prototyping, desk research, processes like co-design, other workshops and working with other workshops with stakeholders and other experts to form outcomes, which can be objects or policies or methodologies. And so I'm going to take you through two projects. The first one, Wet Zones, is where I kind of develop the way I work today. And that was supported by the Fondazione Studio Rizoma. It was a project based in Palermo with generous support from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And the project was looking at designing the future kitchen of Palermo. So for my Material Futures Masters, I developed the future kitchen of London. I was stuck at home during the pandemic, thinking about the future of water, the way we use water, and how design determines the way we use water. And then I was invited to do the same for Palermo. But having been someone that lived in Sicily for 2 years, I had a bit of an idea of the water system in Sicily, but it wasn't the place that I was from. So it was important for me to embed myself. And thankfully, I had a year to do so, coming back and forth. So one of the first things I did was walk around with the artist Gianluca Concaldi, and he showed me ways that you can walk the rivers that used to sit underneath, what now sit underneath the city. Okay, I was worried this image was going to be super grainy, and it's not, so that's great. So you can see underneath what is now the city of Palermo, there are two major rivers, the kind of blue bit in the middle of the screen. And they're now completely covered over. So there was lots of farming networks in Palermo. The rivers were kind of cut into and different parts were siphoned off. And then over time, the river became kind of an open sewer, a similar thing that happened in London. And eventually, over time, they were covered over bit by bit out of health, but also kind of city planning and just ease. But there are places where these rivers still appear throughout the city, and whether that's in kind of where water now gathers. Roads, this road was directly built over what was a river, and you can walk down that road, and there are holes in the road where you can still see the river running underneath it. This is a Phoenician well that's in the center of the city, and if you look down to the bottom, I realise it's not such a great photo because you can't see the water at the bottom, but there is water under there, and that's right on the path of where the river used to be. There are moments when the river reappears after big storms, when it kind of breaks its confines. And So we did these series of walks with Gianluca, mapping out where the river is hiding in the moments that you can see it. And that, combined with desk research, then moved on to speak to a series of different experts and conduct interviews that then can also be an output and a way of communicating the research. I spoke to people that were on the peripheries of Palermo, so places where the water comes from to feed the city, but also people that are based within the city. So it was like dry farmers that don't use water but know a lot about the history of water, and that's why they don't use it. Farmers that do use water but see themselves as custodians of water. The people in the bottom left-hand corner work in a sort of city garden where there used to be a river that ran through there, but now it kind of just appears in the morning as dew on the grass. Then you have Manfredi, who's a landscape architect and an engineer. I also interviewed a tour guide who does tours about the water and walks around the city to see kind of the undulations of the city and where the water was and is no more, and various other people. And this was to try and get a broad picture of the water situation in Palermo. And what kind of came out from that research is that actually everyone has a slightly different idea of what the situation in Palermo is. Some people say there's lots of water, it's not a problem. Water is actually there's a lot of water in Palermo. It's not somewhere that is struggling. It's the surrounding area that's struggling. Some people say you can drink the tap water. Some people say you can't. Manfredi talks about how Palermo is going to be underwater in the near future. So everyone has a very different idea of what the future is going to look like. So taking kind of all these different conversations forward, I then go into a kind of workshop process, which is where I kind of pick out questions from the conversations I've had, and then I invite the people that I've been speaking to and other people, experts or kind of key stakeholders, to answer these questions. And we do this thing that I call future building, where you try and build an idea of what each different person thinks the future is going to look like, and then you combine that together for a kind of collective idea of the future. And that's a framework that you can then design into. Another fun thing to do is rapid prototyping, where you give people 30 seconds to a minute to answer questions about how you might be making water in the future, or if you were NASA, how would you make a cup of tea in the future or something. And then moving on from that, I broke them off into small groups, and we started thinking about designing a kitchen. Kind of below this, it was on a big Miro board, and below this you have all the different parts of a kitchen, and extra parts, and just like squares and circles and whatever. And then people can design a kitchen from the perspective of the water, or design it from the perspective of the animals that live in the surrounding landscape. And through this process, you can start thinking about what this future kitchen could look like. And so from that, a year later, I worked with a local design studio called Marginal Studios to develop this water recycling kitchen, where we decided so it had a source of rainwater and a source of mains water to be used for different tasks. And then it had 3 different sinks where you split up the way you used water in these different sinks to actually keep the contaminants separate, and then had 2 different biofilters that then fed into. Everything was made with materials you could find locally. There's a big sailing culture around there, so we use kind of boat parts for various parts of the kitchen as well. And it was designed to live outside. It now lives with a artist and farmer duo that I'll talk again about later. And they're using it as these kind of big participatory dinners that they have on their land with their really interesting seed project. So from this process, I kind of developed this rough working methodology where it essentially kind of communicates what I've just talked about, but it's like desk research. It's kind of setting the scene with speaking to as many people as possible, doing as much research as you can, defining a concept from that, then user testing that concept and workshopping ideas, taking that onto a prototype stage, user testing those again. And if you don't have if through that user testing it's not meeting the requirements, you take it back. It's kind of, I quite like that it's just a continuous circle in a way. It's like, maybe if you get to the end and you assess the impact and it's the impact that you wanted, then the project stops, but if it doesn't, then you can continue going. So now I'm going to move on to the next project that I'm going to talk about, yeah? Which is where I continued working in this methodology, but it's broader, it's a bit more, I'm working with kind of insensible change due to the climate crisis and how design can help us relate to things that we can't sense. And this was the project that was supported by the Design Museum. So human-induced climate change is altering plant scent, which is impacting plant-to-pollinator interactions as they look for food. And this is in turn affecting evolution for both plants and their pollinators. And this project did come from all the water research I was doing before and kind of just realizing the interconnectedness of everything. And so one of the key reasons that plants are changing the way they smell is because of their access or not to water. And so coming back to Anand Singh and also Catherine Youssef, they talk about how tools for noticing are really important in this moment to understand and comprehend what's happening around us. And Catherine Youssef specifically talks about how our abilities to make non-human worlds intelligible if biodiversity loss is for the most part lost to sense. So how can we find ways to recognize what's happening around us when we might not be able to sense it because of the limitations of our sensory experience, but also limitations in space and time. So again, setting the scene, speaking to as many experts as would speak to me. We've got perfumers, we've got people that farm scent, but then we also have farmers that are kind of thinking about pollination and how to get pollinators to pollinate their crops, because they care about them going to seed, which is the kind of key point. And then various kinds of scientists that are looking at plant evolution, plant scent, and the plant-pollinator interactions. And am I speaking too fast?
No, you're good.
Okay, good. This is going quite quickly. So the first kind of outcome of this project was thinking about, how to start communicating this insensible world. And I was speaking to an incredible scientist called Dr. Diana Campbell, and she works at this place called the Rocky Mountains Biological Laboratory in Colorado. And she's been researching this, I'll go back to that previous slide, but she's been researching this wildflower called the Epimopsis aggregata. Another species within the family is called the Epimopsis tenuotuber, and the hybrid that kind of lives between their comfortable zones on the mountain. She's been researching that for 40 years, which is quite an incredible, large amount of data. And we don't get that kind of thing that often. And because she has so much data, she can begin to predict semi-confidently how this plant might continue to evolve in the future, because she's combining that research that she's been doing on this plant with a scientist who's also been looking at changing weather patterns in the area and other scientists that work at this lab. And so one of the things that she does to predict this is she starts to simulate climate change in the wild. On the left-hand side, these black mats make the snow underneath melt faster, so then she can do tests on the flowers that grow when the whole snow melts, if there's any changes, if the snow melts a week earlier, because this is the prediction that the snow will continue to melt earlier and earlier. And on the right-hand side, you've got rain-off shelters, so they collect 50% of the rain that falls in that area, and then she can do tests on the flowers that come out. And so from that, she can begin to try and predict what's going to happen to ecosystems in the future. And so, this is on the left-hand side, you've got the Epimopsis aggregata, which is the red one. On the right-hand side, you've got the hybrid, which is pink. And here you can just see between Diane, one of her students, the white one, which is the Epimopsis tenuotuber, and that lives on the highest point of the mountain. And an interesting point about that plant is that as climates change, the kind of comfortable habitats of these plants are moving their way up the mountain. And kind of we think about plants maybe migrating north as climates change, but this one will migrate up and eventually will run out of mountain. So there's kind of many different challenges that these plants are facing at the moment. So based on her, all of her data, and then working with climate predictions for the next 100 years, as confidently as we can, it's very difficult to predict the future of precipitation. We worked with a botanical illustrator to draw up how the flower looks today, how it look in 50 years, and then how it look in 100 years in the future. And this animation shows that a bit better. So you can see over the next 100 years, this plant is predicted to get slightly wider, to become shorter. The stamens in the middle are going to stay at the same length, so they're going to start appearing at the top. And we don't really know why it might do this, whether it's for kind of pollination reasons. Those are all theories as to why a plant might do something, but these are predicted visual changes. So, and what I find really exciting about doing things like this is I feel like we kind of feel like evolution is something that happened and has kind of happened and we're evolved. But actually plants, I mean, famously Alexandra Antonelli says that plants are going to have to evolve 10,000 times faster to keep up with the rate of climate change, and some will just not be able to do that. So these kinds of predictions on which ones might or might not can help us make decisions today about what's going to happen in the future. And those are, for the large part, design decisions. So that was kind of looking at design as tools for noticing. And then the second part was thinking about, so what's a design intervention here? Like, how can we use this research to make decisions about the way that we design things differently? So Terra Terra is an artist and farmer duo based in Palermo who I've been collaborating with for quite a few years now. They have a really amazing observational practice. They developed this thing called post-varietal evolutive communities. And this is kind of planting lots of different species from the same family together in proximity to allow them to have the opportunity to naturally hybridize between them in an attempt to allow pollinator-decided adaptation and evolution between these species instead of human-selected. So yeah, seed selections which are designed to support and evolve together, promoting a critical discourse around varieties and reliability. We've just launched a website called the Critical Seed Library, which lists a lot of the different seeds they've been looking at and their histories, and also places that people that you can get those seeds from if you're interested in continuing that cycle. And they're questioning cultural expectations around food and allowing non-human preference to be the decision maker in the hybridization and evolution of species instead of humans, just like I was saying before. So together we designed a garden at the Design Museum, and this was, I mean, they look at food, but because I was looking at changing scent and evolution of plants, I thought it was interesting to look at a more ornamental garden for this project, and it also could allow the potential to people to think about how they might plant their ornamental gardens differently in the city. And we looked at the family of the Brassicaceae family because we found many papers saying that these plants, some of them, their scent was impacted by pollution, of which there's a lot in London, but they also very easily hybridize between each other. So it was an exciting opportunity to plant 9 different species from this family together in proximity in the Design Museum garden. This is the plan that we worked from. So any of the kind of yellowish circles are different plants from the Brassicaceae family, and then there are lots of other plants in there to create less of a monoculture, more of a healthy ecosystem, fix nitrogen into the soil, attract moths and flies and butterflies and other kinds of pollinators. And each year we will collect the seeds. Ideally, we'll find a way to get the scientists there that I've been working with in Kew to actually test the smell of those plants, and each year see if the smells are changing or if there's any visible differentiation in the traits, and if some of the plants that scent is affected by pollution are being positively impacted by hybridization with ones that are less affected. So that's the full list. It's also available online if anyone wants to do this experiment at home. And part 3, so you're going to get to experience this in the bar afterwards. And this was working with perfumers and with scientists who are doing this kind of research and working from the data in their research to translate that back into scent so we can have the opportunity to smell that difference. Because say a rosemary bush is experiencing drought in one part of the world and it's not experiencing drought in another part of the world, we're not going to get the opportunity to smell the difference between those two because of proximity, because of inhibitions in space. But through this method, we were trying to do that. So here's a nice diagram that kind of communicates that. So when the rosemary has enough access to water, the bees are attracted to it. It's releasing all the right compounds. When it has less access to water, those plants change the way they smell, and the bees reject it, and they go and find something that is more. It's kind of telling them it has enough nectar, which is essentially they don't want to waste time and energy visiting plants that aren't going to give them enough food. And so I worked with a perfumer in Scotland called Clara Wheel to develop these scents. And she put together one of the smells you'll be smelling upstairs is jasmine. And this shows you how the scent of jasmine changes in between 4 different temperatures. So on the left-hand side, that's not all of the compounds that are in jasmine, but it's the key compounds you need to make up the smell of jasmine. And you can see at 30 degrees, there is a spike in quite a few of these compounds, and that will really change the way it smells. And humans can detect that, but pollinators can detect it even more. So yeah, this is what we were doing together, and it's really interesting trying to develop the smell of a living plant from the data that we were given by scientists, because perfumers make scent traditionally from removing the plant from the soil, and as soon as you remove the plant from the soil or you cut a flower off a bush or whatever, it stops releasing some of the compounds that it releases when it's alive. So when perfumers are recreating the smell of jasmine, I guess it's recreating the smell of dead jasmine. But when scientists are analysing the scent of a living plant and how that's changing based on its conditions, they're analysing the smell of a living plant. And that is releasing different compounds, or it can be releasing more compounds. But those are quite difficult to access when you're working in perfumery, because traditionally they aren't needed to make up that scent. And even a lot of them, perfumers are like, well, our human nose can't smell them anyway, so what's the point in adding them in the scent? But we found every single molecule, some of which were very difficult to find, to recreate exactly the smell of these living flowers, to see if we could smell the difference. And it's great that we can. Otherwise, that might have been a bit embarrassing. And that was on show at the Design Museum over the summer. But they're the smells that you can smell afterwards as well, in a context a bit more like this, where I'm going to give you scent strips. So yeah, join me for smelling in the bar, but also Keane's going to be doing a workshop up there as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to put on this holding slide. Yes. And we'll do a Q&A.
That's it. Okay, can you go back to slide 35 though?
Okay.
Sorry, if anyone has any questions, you can totally raise your hands, but I've already got someone. So I saw this planting. I've never done a planting before, and I was just kind of curious. Do you know how, I can see that they seem to have spread them out, but is there anything in particular you're doing when you are doing a mixed planting like this?
Well, I worked with a garden designer on this.
Yeah.
We, visually for human preference, we were keeping them separate so you could see all of the different. I think there was a conversation at one point about potentially keeping them together in strips, and you could almost a bit like a food forest type farming method, I guess, where you've got things in different strips and you could really see the different kinds of plants. But on the gardener's recommendation, we went for a kind of more mixed look. And so that was the design decision.
Okay.
But within that proximity, I guess also if you have things in strips, then the pollinators can easily just go more between each one that they preferred. But if they're more separated, then they might find different ones along the way, and that might increase the opportunity to hybridize.
Okay, nice. Okay. Does anyone have any questions for us about anything? Do we need to give a microphone?
Yes.
Sure.
Wonderful stuff. Well, this one's for Eliza. I was just going to ask about the ethical implications of climate-proofing plants, and what's the... If that's too big of a question, don't worry.
No, it's not too big of a question. I mean, maybe do you want to be more specific, or kind of do you mean the risk of potentially creating a hybrid that could be detrimental to an ecosystem, or?
Yeah, both the risk, but also the idea of gatekeeping a plant that can survive. and like sharing and kind of that kind of idea.
In terms of the things that I was talking about, or
Yeah, so with like if you produce the plant or provide somehow successfully a scent that can survive this climate change,
yeah.
what are the ethical implications of holding that species and being able to distribute it, or like what's the next step with that?
So, I mean, that's not ever the way that I would work personally. Because, I mean, yeah, the way that me and Terra Terra work is that we're creating an environment where a hybrid could happen. And if it does, and then that's something interesting to talk about, then we would talk about it. I mean, they're seed savers themselves. So if any new hybrid came from that, they would collect and save those seeds. And then those seeds are available to anyone who wants to take those and continue producing them. I mean, I won't speak on this too much because I'd want to like check everything I was going to say first, but there are, so there's a tomato called the Pimpinelli Folio, I think, something like that. It's the pimp tomato, and it's native to Peru, and it's a very resilient tomato. And I think more recently people have been crossing those genes back with domesticated tomatoes that are much less resilient because they've been domesticated for so long. And because this is a wild tomato, it's very resilient. It's been adapting to the changing environment in Peru. But now, I don't know if this is specific with that tomato, but definitely in other cases, countries are like, well, actually, we're not just going to continue giving you the genes to this resilient tomato. I guess especially countries in the West. And then that becomes a bit more of a trading situation. But I don't know the full extent of it, but I think it's not quite answering your question, but it's almost like another provocation to the question. But yeah, I mean, I don't believe in gatekeeping seeds, personally.
No, thank you.
Thanks.
Good question for Kieran. First, I'll make a bit of a broader comment, but about 9-10 years ago, I mean, by the way, I'm really glad that you're going to regenerative design and architecture. It's about 9-10 years ago, with my family, we moved to rural Devon in the Dartmoor, and we set up a community land trust, and we kind of wanted to build like self-built houses with cob and straw bale and all that kind of stuff, and we got like ecologists. She produced like designs for like all the biodiversity on site and what else we can add to. And we had reed beds, we had dry toilets, dry composting toilets, we had grey water ponds with reeds, and like we chucked everything, basically everything that is in the book of like regenerative design. We were intending to plant like 10,000 oak trees to offset carbon of some of the structures, and the energy has been built. So it was all about, of course, that in a way, by inhabiting that land, the biodiversity improves in many times better over the lifetime you or the community lives there. And it was all about like the houses were supposed to be sold on at a discount to local people after like once lives, etc. And yeah, we didn't get any support. I mean, the parish council completely kind of and Dartmoor National Park completely like weren't interested. But I kind of get it. I mean, when I was there, I realized that there is no point of sitting on national parks land and perhaps preventing this type of development, because if you keep the land as it is, the biodiversity is in decline anyway. So basically, you're not really helping. I mean, you're not pouring concrete over it, but actually you're not really helping. But actually, if you allow regenerative design to happen in this kind of community types, then you're actually starting to help it, and you're kind of pushing it up and up and up. But there is still such a big gap between people's perception of actually what should be done and not. And people just sit on empty kind of fields. And that's the idea of like, just kind of how the countryside should look like. So it's very difficult, I think, a very difficult task.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's quick. And so the bioregion project, where they've actually created they created a bioregion, a story of place for the bioregion of Devon, actually. So they're actually going through a long process of like understanding what's the history of this site, what is it good for, what is the kind of characteristics of it, like what will it be like in the future. There's a whole part of like, and that like really that definition of like that it should thrive. I imagine your thing might have thrived, but would it co-evolve? Like, was there? I think often when you draw a red line around your site, you're not actually thinking about the impact that it's going to have. If you double the population of a town, that's really going to affect that town. So that town needs to know how they're going to evolve with that site that you're working on. So I can completely understand why people, if you impose this, would reject it. But if they're part of that kind of designing that growth through that, then it would happen. And so you can say that you did everything in the regenerative playbook, but I'd say that actually there's like an aspect of like considering that co-evolution over time, and then also then how it renew in the future. Like if you leave these things with people who don't really understand it, then it's not going to renew as well. And then I'd question the kind of how far back did you go into the history of your site analysis? When you read that Bioregen's kind of story of place for the whole of Devon, they go back to like finding the kind of when it's referenced in the Doomsday Book and how that's affected it, and they kind of so it goes way further back to understand the characteristics for the projects that they want to work on. So I think this is where I'm saying is that I think that people are saying that they're doing regenerative design, and I think they're doing good, but I think actually it's a way larger systemic design process to be regenerative. That's what I'm saying. But I love it. It's good.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I think this issue of the speed with which one can regenerate depends an enormous amount about the paradigm shift in the way we structure, the way we talk about things. Things lag behind, but I think there are changes afoot in the sense that if you look at the concentration in the budget today, there's an enormous amount in it that is actually very positive in terms of cooperation and linking systems, thinking in terms of systems. I've got a project which I've worked on for 30 years in Cornwall, which is a prototype for, in fact, it includes a garden, but it's not just a garden. It's a whole system of actually raising the level of curiosity, which actually makes a higher level of energy, mental energy, in a population as a whole. And I think actually if you can capture that, things happen extremely fast, because it's not a question of space and time, it's a question of energy running through the whole lot.
No, I think you're really right. There's a really interesting that happened with some of the green movement, with some of those eco developments that have come up, and actually that they again have really good intentions, but they never set up a system of really keeping that knowledge there, keeping a system of renewing. So actually, I think what you're right is like if you can really get people into the project.
Well, I've been at this since the 1960s, so it's a long time.
It's a long time.
But actually, it is something about it's a mentality issue, and I think it's really exciting. Actually, I think we're in very exciting times. I
think you're right. Like when you go into this and you kind of see the energy of people who experience what you've created, and the energy that and what that takes them somewhere else to do something else with that. Like there's a clear distinction between projects that give people energy that really enthuse people, and projects that exist and you can see that it's going to decline. So well done for having the staying power for doing it so long.
I mean, that's something that we talked about a bit, wasn't it? Maintenance.
Sorry, you have to talk into your mic.
That was something we talked a bit about in terms of maintenance and longevity of projects, right?
Yeah.
And that being part of your system, what happens if there isn't the funds, for example, which are a big part of every project, to be able to continue the maintenance or continue the research that is necessary to, in my case, have a data set large enough to be able to predict the future. In your case, to be able to reach regenerative.
Yeah, I think, and I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's easy to kind of have that money in perpetuity. I think you can say, oh, we're not going to get it, so we may as well just do something and it'll decline. And I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, because then you'll probably spend more money trying to fix it later on down the line. And I think kind of making sure that there is a way for there to be this kind of continuous energy into places. Like the places that continue have that continuous energy, and so they can be maintained, and it works like that. And it like over long term, it kind of makes sense. Like I think it was really interesting. Your water project, we were talking about that one. That kind of there was this kind of they had this mindset that let's just cover the rivers and let's not maintain it. And now you're having issues that come with the fact that they thought of a project, they implemented it, didn't maintain it, and so it's kind of falling up. It's not doing it. It'll need some repair. It'll need some repair, and it already needs repair because you showed those examples where it was overflowing. So but it's fun to put in.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Then in terms of kind of go back as far as you can, realize what a place wants to be, and then it will maintain itself.
Yeah,
in theory.
I really like. There's some really nice ones where projects where they've started to uncover the rivers that they've buried before, and they're like acknowledging their kind of benefits. They come with blue-green infrastructure. So there is a scope for that to happen.
Yeah, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
Hello. I was very interested in the fact that plants are migrating. I didn't think, I mean, obviously they would migrate, but I didn't think of it until you said it, that they would just migrate just upwards, just to be closer to their current, what they're used to. I was wondering how intrusive these plants are evolving into. Like how do they become more intrusive in the way that they're migrating, or are they keeping the same kind of formation of how they move around as they used to, but they're just trying to do it, I guess, to the climate that they're kind of used to going to.
Yeah, I guess intrusive. I mean, if a plant manages, because they're also the issue with the Epimopsis tenutuber is if you're migrating upwards, ideally you could also be migrating north, or like it's unlike, well, it could happen that a seed is kind of dropped in the optimum new climate and then that plant can continue to grow there. But if that doesn't happen, then it's at risk of going extinct. But to what you were saying, yeah, I guess if a plant is migrating and ends up in a place where it's in better conditions than it was in before, then potentially could become invasive, right. Or I can't remember the word you were using, intrusive. I don't know if that's like, I mean, that's going to vary from plant to plant. Like there are plants that are able to move much quicker because they have faster cycles. But if you look at trees, for example, that's much more difficult for them to move around, north, or like wherever they would rather be. There's a really interesting work by a scientist called Avery Hill in the States as well. And actually he hasn't released the paper yet, but he's doing work on like what it means for something to be native and what it means if like humans have been a part of moving things around for thousands of years. But now we understand the implications of some of those interventions that have been less positive. How do we continue that human-nature interaction, which has been going for many years, and we are a keystone species all over the world, I guess. And yeah, how do we keep that relationship, keep it more positive?
Would you say that there would be a globalization in terms of the movements of these plant lives? In terms of, as you said, if they're moved to a climate that they're kind of accustomed to, and instead of them kind of trying to slowly migrate to something that's more comfortable for them, if through like globalization we move them to somewhere, then kind of like have them be, you know, in a place that they're actually accustomed to, that kind of like globalization of the plants.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge ethical debate as well, like whether that would be a good idea or not. I mean, you can, if a plant is no longer working in its current environment, you can move it to a botanical archive and keep it there until a decision is made. But then does that plant continue to be able, if you keep a seed for too long in a seed bank, when you replant it, sometimes it might not be, it hasn't had that process of adaptation to like where the world is at the point that it's replanted as well. So there are lots of different issues with like saving seeds, replanting seeds. Yeah, so just giving you more questions. Really.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was fantastic.
That was really, working with the gardens was also really interesting because they were talking about the kind of occasionally they always talk about the colonized language that's used in horticulture, and this idea of like native and non-native, and not thinking of it as like successful immigrants that have been here for a long time.
Yeah.
Like squirrels, like grey squirrels and rabbits and other things. And there's like, plants have moved for a long period of time, and they're gonna move for a long period of time.
Yeah, exactly. I'd agree.
The study of the oaks that have dealt with climate change. I mean, there's a book, a wonderful book written about the oaks surviving by going back to how they were when the climate was different.
Wow. Okay.
The Spanish oaks, so that the oaks now, which have got a memory, I've got a memory of what it was like 400 years ago in Spain. I was like, I mean,
like the same oak tree.
I'm sure you know that book, don't you?
No, I don't know that book.
Oh, right, okay.
But I would love to know it if you can remember the name.
I will in a minute. I think it's about the behaviour of trees.
No, that sounds amazing. Yeah, I mean, I've been talking to people about how like the oak tree in the UK is no longer particularly well adapted to the current climate in the UK. So do we start swapping out that oak with oak trees from Southern Europe, for example?
But the same trees can find memory within themselves to change their appearance and change the way
adapt.
their leaves work.
That's incredible, yeah.
There was a good talk here yesterday about the Hook Park's 100-year plan, and they were talking about how they're having to think about the species that they're planning to plant that are going to be available in 100 years. And oak was not very high on that list.
Yes.
Question.
You just said that it was an ethical dilemma of maybe moving seeds to plant them somewhere else. But at the beginning of your talk, you said that you could plant a rose bush anywhere and it would be fine. But if you wanted to plant seeds for the most apt terrain, that you should do that. So out those two options, which is the best thing to do?
So mine was definitely showing you can make things work in a place they don't want to be. You can make a rosebush work, but I'm saying that often a wild meadow will flourish way greater and will lead to a much larger amount of biodiversity, than if you're like very imposing and saying, this is what I'm going to plant on this ground. I'm not going to care about the pH. I'm not going to care about the animals around. I'm not going to care about the history. I'm just going to plant this. You can make that work. We've gotten really good at doing that. But I'm not saying it's a good thing, because I think that's what I'm saying is if you understand it, you can create something that's kind of unanticipated. You can really thrive.
Yeah.
So that's where I sit on it. And that's what I was trying to get across. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I mean, that's also what we were looking at with this hybridizing garden, is kind of how humans love kind of consistency. They want a garden to look a certain way. They want to like force a rose bush to grow there if they want a rose bush in their garden. But this planting scheme also allows kind of an opportunity to plant something that is more adaptive and hybridizing and maybe working with a combination of techniques. You could look at what that land really wants, and then what are the other species that are similar to those that the land wants, and how you can then allow planting different species within the same family in a garden to increase its adaptability in the future.
Yeah, because we were looking at this diagram before and we were like, this is really nice. It shows a kind of thriving environment. But actually, what you're not seeing is the larger context around this diagram. So we don't know if there's trees around. We don't know what there's buildings around there. We don't know if there's like what kind of bees are in this area. We don't kind of birds, squirrels, anything else. And so we don't actually, although this project might produce something quite beautiful, we don't know if it's actually the most beautiful thing, the largest impact, the largest thriving thing that we could have created on the site, because it's just not connected to its site really and what's going on around it. Like we don't even know what kind of soil is underneath this.
Yeah, it's clayey, I think. Quite
It's
clay
always
soil.
There's always clay in it. Some clay.
Yeah, sorry, maybe, oh God, it's quite intense. Maybe to both of you. And just also to preface this with that I am very I want to be convinced of this question, that I'm coming from a sort of landscape heritage background, and I'm really interested in the way that both of you talked about kind of going quite far back work and thinking about, the history, the heritage, the land use of a place, and that being important in thinking about design. I suppose, that's like music to my ears. I want to hear that, but I also would really like you to maybe speak a bit more on that. And I wondered kind of what your experience was working with stakeholders, talking to people. Maybe in the case of Woolworth Gardens, there's like threat to use of land all over that area, and like the present is so on top of us. Or in the case of like climate emergency, where that's felt so heavily, kind of to what extent do you find that stakeholders at large, communities at large, people that you speak to are able to feel engaged with that idea of the history or the energy of the place being really key to decision making in the design in the current moment?
Just one thought. I find the process of having those conversations with stakeholders through my process of learning as much as I can about a place. It's different because I don't quite go kind of as far back as Kian. I'm more like trying to understand the present, their remembered history, or maybe their history their grandparents told them, and then kind of what they think the future's going to look like. But the process of involving them in the process creates an interest in the output. And what I found with the Palermo kitchen is that was then immediately adopted back into the community and is now being taken care of and being used for dinners, and the biofilters are being maintained. And I feel that strongly because there was a year's worth of like on the ground connection and conversation, and really building on their like hopes and fears and what they did and didn't trust, and like in factoring that into the design decisions, which I believe ended up being quite a successful project in the end. Does that answer the question? I'll pass it to Kim.
No, I think it's good. I think it's interesting because you there's parts of this where you kind of are looking on your own at kind of seeing and like reading about the history of the place. And there's moments where you're talking to someone and you're like, where is here? How far do I walk and then I'm no longer here? What do you do here? What did they do over there? And it's really interesting just how many kind of similar answers you get to those kind of questions, and you can feel themes to these kind of things, and it's interesting because we use a lot of verbs. I think the word's verbs. It's because we say we can make a story of place, but the entire thing is about storing place. It's actually how do you create a continuous story through that process. So it's like, how do we understand what's going on there now, and how can we also then what would be the best thing in the future of this place? And so it's a really interesting process to go through, and you can kind of, and it's really interesting just that things really do fall through, that consistently people want the same kind of things, or the same kind of things are important to them because of the characteristics of the place, the people, and how people live in that place. So it felt, when I did it the first time, it felt really unfamiliar and it felt impossible. And like they showed really nice examples, and I was like, I didn't really believe them. And then you go through the process and you're like, this is really working, and I don't really know why, but it seems to really, people seem to be really digging it. And so I just encourage you to try it, and it could be really nice. Thanks. Should we wrap up there?
Yeah, let's wrap up. And just, anyone want to join us upstairs? And you can smell the smell of changing plants, and you can...
We might do a workshop.
Maybe do a workshop.
Maybe have a glass of wine and work it out.
Okay.
So thank you all for coming.
You.
Thank you to AV, thank you to Public Program, thank you to States, thanks to security, and thank you all.
Thank you.